Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Steve Hinch, and I'm here tonight to share with you some stories of the canyon country of the American Southwest. I'd first of all like to thank the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance for inviting me to make this presentation. SUWA is doing a tremendous job of helping protect the wildlands of Utah, and I am only too happy to help. Now, like you, I love canyon country, but I live far away from it. In my case, I live in the town of Santa Rosa, California, and it's about 1,000-mile drive for me to get from my house to canyon country. And while I have explored these lands for over 40 years, I felt like I needed an excuse to get out here more often. And so I decided to write a book about them, a book that I called The Slickrock Desert: Journeys of Discovery in an Endangered American Wilderness. In it, I use stories of my own explorations to introduce the reader to the history, natural history, geology, paleontology, and what we know of the earliest inhabitants of this wonderful land. I'm honored to say that just a few months ago, the publishing industry's largest trade association, IBPA, named it winner of a prestigious Benjamin Franklin Award for being judged one of the best books of the year in its category. Now, I had more in mind when I wrote this book than just having an excuse to get out there more often. As the book's subtitle says, this is an endangered American wilderness, and I wanted all of you to understand this. But early on, I decided I did not want to write a book that just hits you over the head with that. I felt the best approach was to write a book that inspires you, not one that depresses you. So that's what I've done. Of course, I do have to talk about some of the risks to this land, but only after I've shown why it's so important to protect it. So what I'm going to do tonight is share some of the stories from the book and show you a number of photographs. Many of these photos are from the book, but I've also included others that we had to leave out for space reasons, but still illustrate topics from the book. Now, your first question might be, what do you mean, Steve, by the Slickrock Desert? And here's a map that shows it. It's roughly equivalent to what the U.S. Geological Survey calls the Colorado Plateau, an elevated landscape that stretches across the southeastern portion of Utah, the northeastern portion of Arizona, and the western edges of Colorado and New Mexico. Now, I can't claim to have invented the term Slickrock Desert. I first came across it in a brief reference the author Edward Abbey made to it in his classic book, Desert Solitaire. I thought it was a great description, so I used it as my title. It's a magnificent land ranging from broad vistas of naked sandstone, like this view from Mesa Arch in Canyonlands Island in the Sky District, to almost surreal views like this lone willow fighting for survival on a cliff in the Andy Miller Flats region of Glen Canyon. Now, when I took this photo, one of the photographers I was with said he had been to this same spot 10 years earlier, and the scene looked exactly the same then as it did here. Humans have lived here for at least 13,000 years. Now, there are not very many remnants of the earliest cultures, but the land is noted for the impressive ruins of stone cities built into cliffs by a civilization that we call the ancestral Pueblo culture. The one you see here is Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde. It is typical of the last stages of the culture, built around 800 years ago and abandoned less than 100 years later. Now, early pioneers settled this land in the late 1800s, constructing simple structures like this log cabin in Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. In the 1950s, the land was overrun with prospectors searching for uranium, the key ingredient of nuclear weapons and power plants. Most prospectors left poorer than when they arrived, but a few did become multimillionaires. The mine you see here, the Mi Vida mine, south of Moab, was the one that proved you could get rich if you knew where to look. Now, mines like this have long since ceased to be productive, and the most lasting legacy of the great uranium rush is over 1,200 miles of dirt roads, originally bulldozed for prospectors, and now favorite tracks for backcountry explorers. Photography has always been important to me, and photographs have always been a key part of my earlier books. In such a photogenic country, it was only natural that I would want to include photos to complement my text. And in my earlier days, I would head out for a week at a time with a 4x5 field camera like you see here, which up until about maybe 15 or 20 years ago was the go-to camera for any serious landscape photographer. I've long since switched to digital, but some of the photos in the book are from those earlier days. And here's an example. This is the first photo from the first chapter in my book, a chapter I call Sunrise. It's at a place called Pothole Point in Canyonlands National Park. And in the book, I share how I took the photo, and I use it to tell the story of the life cycles of the animals that live within potholes. Animals like fairy shrimp, tadpole shrimp, and a unique 8-legged microscopic creature called a tardigrade, the only animal known to have survived exposure to the frigid vacuum and intense radiation of outer space. I took this photo at sunrise one early spring morning. I had camped out nearby the night before, and I actually had to set up my tent in a snowstorm. The snow was gone by morning, but it was still cold. The thermometer hanging on my backpack read 29 degrees. And if you look, you can see ice on the surface of this pothole. Now, I've never been a morning person, especially when it's only 29 degrees out. But after driving 1,000 miles to get here, I forced myself to get up and make this shot. This is how the photo looks in the book. We had to print it in black and white because it would have been too expensive to print all of the interior photos in color. But I did take the photo in color. And this is what it looked like when I was there. I think you get a better sense of that icy spring morning in color than in black and white. Here's another example from the book. This is Angel Arch, which you come to after a many-mile hike down Salt Creek Canyon in the Needles district of Canyonlands. It's the largest arch in the park, standing nearly 150 feet tall. This is another place where I had camped out the night before, and I got up early to get this shot. But at least this morning it was not 29 degrees out. Again, this is what it looks like in the book, and this is what it looked like in color. So by attending my presentation this evening, you get to see some things that readers of the book don't get to see. Now, whenever I give a presentation like this, somebody always asks me where my favorite places are in Canyonlands. Now, that's a bit like asking me who my favorite child is, so I never give a direct answer. And besides, my favorite places are the ones that I like to keep secret. So while I won't tell you my favorite places, I will tell you some of the places that I really like to go. And this is one of them, a region called Cedar Mesa in the far southeast corner of Utah. Though it's called Cedar Mesa, not a single cedar grows naturally anywhere on it. It was named in 1880 by a Mormon expedition who mistook its many junipers for the cedar trees that they were more familiar with. One of Cedar Mesa's key features is a 50-mile-long gash in the land called Grand Gulch. Here's the start of a 2-mile-long trail down into it from Collins Canyon, which is one of the lesser-used trailheads. Here's a view from the canyon floor at a place called the Narrows. Now, water is unusual here, but I took this right after a rainstorm. Grand Gulch is one of the most prolific regions of ancestral Pueblo habitation, not in grand cities like Mesa Verde, but in much smaller single-family structures like this one at Bannister House. Structures built into the side of cliffs came only toward the end of the ancestral Pueblo civilization, presumably because they needed defense against raiders. It must have been a difficult decision. Can you imagine trying to raise a 2-year-old on the side of a cliff like this? You can still see occasional relics like these pottery sherds from that time. But if you go, remember that all relics like these are federally protected. So enjoy them in place and resist the temptation to put any of them in your pocket. Rangers are quick to hand out expensive fines if you do so. Many of the cliff walls are covered in rock art like the handprint pictographs you see here. Camping is prohibited near rock art, but that's not a problem. This was one of my campsites, and I did not even bring a tent. I did bring plenty of water, though. Rangers recommend at least a gallon per day and don't count on finding any along the way. Here are some examples of the kind of rock art on the canyon walls. Almost everything you find in Grand Gulch are what are known as pictographs, pictures that are painted onto the walls. Here's some more examples, and I think you can understand why some people imagine that the ancient artists must have been visited by extraterrestrial aliens. Now, elsewhere in canyon country, you will find the other main type of rock art, petroglyphs. These are figures that are pecked into the rock itself, like these found in Capitol Reef National Park. And by the way, those pockmarks that you see in the artwork, they were the result of 19th century cowboys using them for target practice. Here's some more pictographs from Grand Gulch. Archaeologists think that the one in the center might be associated with a fertility event, but I'm not convinced it wasn't done by giggling adolescents, similar to the scrawls that you see today on the walls of public bathrooms. This one is particularly moving for me. It contrasts the casually spread fingers of an adult's handprint with the stiffly clenched fingers of a child perhaps making his or her first pictograph. I can't help but wonder how life unfolded for that tiny child of long ago. The Slickrock Desert is famous for its natural arches. Experts say there are 4 types. Freestanding arches are the type that most people imagine, vertical openings encircled by a layer of rock, like this one, Wilson Arch near Moab. A natural bridge is similar, but it spans a stream or water channel. A cliff wall arch, like this unnamed arch near Bluff, is attached to the side of a cliff. A pothole arch is an arch turned on its side. This is probably the most famous pothole arch, called Paul Bunyan's Potty in Canyonlands National Park. Here's probably the world's most famous arch, Delicate Arch in Arches National Park. I'll have to say there's nothing particularly special about my photo here. Countless thousands of other people have taken similar photos, and this arch even shows up on Utah license plates. But this photo has done well for me. It was on a calendar and even on the cover of a book some years ago. I took it with my 4x5 view camera back in the early 1990s, and I wasn't the only one there that afternoon, but there were few enough others that I had no problem taking a photo with no one in the shot. But if you go there today, the situation is much different. This is what you're likely to see, and it's all because of a massive advertising campaign the state of Utah put on starting in 2013. They called it the Mighty Five and used the tagline, 5 national parks, 1 epic vacation, only in Utah. They plastered the message on billboards, magazine ads, television spots, social media, and enormous displays in transportation centers around the world. It was a poorly planned campaign that did not take into account anything about the impact it would have on the parks. That campaign is why, for much of the year now, you can't even get into places like Zion or Arches National Parks without advanced reservations. Now, I'm not here tonight to lament this in detail. I do talk much more about it in my book, including my view of what they should have done. About all I will say now is that scenes like this are why I largely avoid Utah national parks these days and head out to much more secluded places. There are certainly still plenty of them around, and tonight I will talk about 2 of them. The 2 large areas shown in yellow here, Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears National Monuments. Grand Staircase was named a monument in 1996 by President Clinton, and Bears Ears in 2016 by President Obama. Both monuments have been in the news a lot in recent years, primarily because the Utah congressional delegation has called them a massive federal land grab. And Trump tried to drastically reduce their sizes, as you can see here. Now, the truth of the matter is that almost all the lands in the monuments were already federal lands, so there was no federal land grab. And where there were state-owned lands in Grand Staircase, the federal government worked with the state of Utah to complete a massive land swap that gave the state ownership of lands elsewhere in the state that had previously been owned by the federal government. And most of those lands had valuable mineral rights the state was only too happy to get. So this land swap was formally approved not only by Congress, but also by the Utah State Legislature. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this controversy tonight. I just want to clear up one common misunderstanding. Some people claim that these monuments were only created because environmentalists wanted to do nothing more than preserve the scenic beauty of these lands. That was not the primary reason for either of these monuments. Let's start with Grand Staircase Escalante. It was created by President Clinton as an outdoor science laboratory, and during the first decade of its existence, extensive research was conducted in a number of areas like archaeology, botany, paleontology, hydrology, ecology, and geology. Over the years, the monument sponsored several symposia that presented the results of this scientific research. In 2006, over 60 technical papers were presented covering such topics as the discovery of over 25 new dinosaur species, the cataloging of over 600 species of bees, and providing new insights into the relationship between the ancestral Pueblo culture and the modern Hopi tribe. Let's explore Grand Staircase Escalante a little more now. There are three major regions to the monument. The first, on the western side, is the Grand Staircase. Think of it as a huge stairway of sedimentary rock layers climbing from the chocolate cliffs at the lowest level to the pink cliffs at the highest, site of Bryce Canyon National Park. On the monument's east side are the canyons of the Escalante River and the famous Hole in the Rock Road, which was the route of Mormon settlers who came to settle southeastern Utah in 1880. This region includes numerous slot canyons, like the one you see here, Peekaboo Gulch off Hole in the Rock Road. Now, between these two regions lies the high mesa of the Kaparowitz Plateau, which rises to an elevation of over 7,000 feet, and it's seen here in a photo I took from Davis Gulch. The Kaparowitz is particularly important to scientific research, and let me give you just one example. Now, fossils are prevalent throughout the Slickrock Desert, as seen here with this brachiopod fossil I found near the town of Bluff, and this Allosaurus footprint found north of Moab. But probably no discovery has been more important to paleontology than the one made by Dr. Alan Titus, who was the monument's paleontologist, and his team in July of 2014. Dr. Titus had been exploring along a remote stretch of the plateau when he spotted a series of dark shapes emerging from the sandstone. He recognized them as bones from a tyrannosaur. They began digging and soon discovered they were exposing a massive bone bed unlike anything they had seen before. So when Titus returned to the BLM office and told his colleagues about his discovery, the staff did not believe him. One of his colleagues said, "Every site you discover is always rainbows and unicorns," using a slang term for something so amazing it couldn't be true. But Titus's field assistant jumped to his defense and said, "This site really is rainbows and unicorns." The name stuck, and that is what this site is called in every professional paper that has been published about it since then. Now, over the next 7 years, Titus led a team that discovered bones from 5 tyrannosaurs and a multitude of other animals. They determined that all 5 tyrannosaurs were from a single family unit, and ranged in age from 4 to 22 years when they died. Now, until this discovery, most paleontologists thought tyrannosaurs were solitary hunters, but this bone bed has gone a long way toward convincing scientists that tyrannosaurs hunted in packs, which would have been a terrifying proposition if you were a plant-eating dinosaur. Now, the question is, why did they all die together? Well, Titus says that the evidence points to them all having been congregated along the channel of a river, possibly planning a coordinated attack on a nearby duckbill dinosaur that was also found there. But according to Titus, torrential rains caused a massive flood that drowned them all and washed their bodies into a jumbled pile at the edge of a lake. Titus points out that such mass mortalities are not unusual, and they occur even today. In their technical paper, they included a photo of over 100 cattle who were killed in a similar flash flood in Australia just a few years ago. Now, not every paleontologist is convinced of this explanation, and there is still a lot of work to do, but the importance of this discovery in Grand Staircase illustrates how important scientific research is to its future. Fossil sites are prevalent throughout Grand Staircase Escalante, and here's a map that shows over 700 scientifically important sites that would have lost protection if Trump's proclamation to reduce the size of Grand Staircase had been allowed to proceed. This is just one example of how important the entire monument is to scientific research. Now let's turn our attention to Bears Ears National Monument, named for these two mesas that reminded Native Americans of the ears of a bear. This monument came about primarily because of how strongly Native American tribes advocated for its preservation. 5 nations, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Uinta and Ore Ute, the Ute Mountain Ute, and the Zuni, claim these as ancestral homelands. After decades of seeing them destroyed through such practices as mining, oil drilling, irresponsible use of off-road vehicles, and deliberate vandalism, they banded together and petitioned President Obama to protect them. He used the Antiquities Act to do so. There's certainly ample evidence to support their claims of this as an ancestral homeland. Here's one example, a site known as Fallen Roof Ruin in Cedar Mesa. This is another known as House on Fire Ruin in Mule Canyon, and both of these two ruins would have lost their protection under Trump's proclamation. Here's the largest and most unique ruin in Bears Ears, a site called Moon House. These rooms sat behind a solid outer wall with only a few small openings that would have been ideal for firing arrows against ancient raiders. One theory is that Moon House was a regional storehouse for grain and other supplies to serve a population much larger than its few direct inhabitants, sort of an early version of an Amazon distribution warehouse. Now, it's easy for non-natives to question why such a large monument should have been created to preserve what they consider to be just a few obvious relics. But archaeologists say that fewer than 10% of the sites across this landscape have been surveyed, and many of those that have not been surveyed aren't found on canyon walls, but are out in open lands like this. To Native Americans, it's not just a few notable objects that need protection. The entire landscape is sacred to them. At least for now, that protection remains in place. But there continue to be threats to this land, and here's one example, something the state of Utah calls habitat restoration, but it more accurately should be called habitat destruction. Its primary objective is to replace native pinyon juniper forests with grasslands that are more suitable for cattle grazing. Again, if you want to learn more, you can read about it in my book. So let's talk about the work that's being done to protect this landscape through a proposed congressional act known as America's Red Rock Wilderness Act. It would do a lot to preserve native woodlands throughout Utah, woodlands that are essential to helping reduce the impact of climate change across the whole country. Woody shrubs, like those found in pinyon juniper forests, are great at extracting carbon dioxide out of the air, storing the carbon in their wood structures, and releasing the oxygen back into the air. But this only works if we keep those forests intact and don't chop them all down. The act has been introduced into Congress every year since 1989. It still doesn't have enough support to pass, but it continues to grow in importance. It is an area that the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance has been particularly active in promoting. And within the past several months, I and a number of others have met with our congressmen to impress on them how important this act is to the future health of the country. It's a story I would encourage you all to learn more about and ask your own congressperson to support. I'll finish up with a few more photos of this land. This is marching men in Arches National Park. Another view in Arches, this one of the Three Gossips. The magnificent Grand Canyon from Desert View. Fall colors in Zion National Park. A grove of aspens near Bryce Canyon. Cottonwoods in Harris Wash. A great aerial view of Comb Ridge and the San Juan River. 3,000-year-old pictographs in Sego Canyon. Mosquito Arch with a rattlesnake at its base in Valley of Fire. Sadly, this arch fell in the middle of the night some years ago. A lone Navajo rider in Monument Valley. And finally, the first chapter in my book was called Sunrise. The last chapter is called Sunset. There is so much more to this land than what I can cover in a single presentation or book, but I think it's a good way for me to end my talk and encourage you to get out there and enjoy. If you're interested in any of my books, you'll find them in all the normal places, your local bookstore, online outlets like Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or at the Atenera Press website, www.atenera.com. Thanks again for coming. I hope I have inspired you to head out there and explore this wonderful land.